actually, we learned a huge amount about variability in nutritional composition. There really are beans that are much more dense in nutrients than others. None of them cause any issues whatsoever in milling and baking. So it's really good news from that point of view. There's not going to be a kind of day zero when half of the varieties that bean growers were happily growing suddenly become delisted or unpopular or unsuitable for the new market.
That was Donal O'Sullivan from the University of Reading talking about Raising the Pulse, a project which aims to replace 20% of wheat flour in a sliced loaf that you buy from the supermarket. Is it possible? Donal will let us know. You're listening to Inside the Pod from the Processors and Growers Research Organisation, and I'm your host for today, Ben Pike. I'm joined now by Donal O'Sullivan from the University of Reading. Good afternoon, Donal.
Good afternoon, Ben.
Thanks for joining us today. Donal's going to be talking to us about the Raising the Pulse project. Donal, I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners will have perhaps heard about the project, but may not know exactly what it entailed and what its objectives are. Do you want to give us the top line on what you're trying to achieve with it?
Yeah, okay. So Raising the Pulse, it's the name of this. It's a £2 million project. It's been running at the University of Reading since October 2022, so just over 3.5 years. And we're coming into the final months of the project. So this title, Raising the Pulse, is a play on words. It's supposed to remind us that pulse-rich diets lower cardiovascular disease risk. So increasing the amount of pulses we eat may actually not raise our pulse in a bad way, but get the blood circulating a little bit better. So what the project wants to do is to take a health by stealth approach to provide easier opportunities for the UK population to increase their consumption of pulses. And we found that the best kind of Trojan horse vehicle to do that was the white sliced bread loaf. We consume vast quantities of it at home, in the office, when we buy a sandwich, breakfast, evening time, supper, snacks. So it's consumed by nearly all the population in great quantities. It's considered to be relatively nutrient poor. It hasn't got a lot of fiber. It's got a lot of calories, but it's low in protein. Famously, the flour and bread laws require bread flour to be fortified with iron and some B vitamins. So there's that much kind of baseline nutrition, but for the rest, it's a little bit lacking. So we proposed 10 to 20% substitution of the wheat flour that makes up a sliced loaf. And that proposition turns out to kind of lead to several problems that may need to be addressed to turn it into a reality. So the problems that we've tackled range from what would be the best bean varieties most suited to a bread making application, because that was completely unknown. How can faba bean be milled efficiently and at a certain scale, because the cost of flour is going to depend on doing it, kind of on a large scale. And then how does the Chorleywood process of bread making, which is the technical term for the process of making these standard shaped and sized white sliced loaf, how can that be adapted to a new ingredient mix? What do consumers think about the resulting product? And what are the economics of what we've just done? So that's what we spent the last 3.5 years unpacking, all those problems which kind of range from production through to the consumer end. And that's what makes the project a little bit different. It's got this system-wide approach that goes all the way from the farm to the folk who consume it.
So quite a lot to unpack in there. You've obviously got you've got a concept, a basic concept, which on paper makes loads of sense and is quite simple to sort of digest perhaps from a consumer's point of view. You can see what you're trying to achieve, but as usual, the minute you start unpicking, how you go about doing it, you start hitting some of these barriers. So, what's your sort of involvement been? Your personal involvement? Where's your area of expertise that you've been contributing to the project on?
Yeah. So my area of expertise is really in the genetic makeup of faba beans, and we've looked at, you know, anti-nutrients like lysine. So we've studied the basis for that and helped breeders to breed low lysine varieties, which are coming through in the marketplace nowadays. That makes beans an easier proposition for the food manufacturer because they don't have to be concerned about the small percentage of consumers who may perceive a risk of favism to themselves when they consume products containing faba bean. We've been looking at protein content. Main reason behind that is that we're often told that faba bean doesn't compete well with soybean as a source of protein, either in the human or animal diets. Soybean protein is kind of more concentrated. So that's something we've been working on as well. So yeah, I've been involved mainly in trying to discern between the available variety of bean types that are in the marketplace, which would be of more suitable for the end game we have in mind. And I can give you kind of a spoiler alert. Actually, we learned a huge amount about variability in nutritional composition. There really are beans that are much more dense in nutrients than others, but they're all kind of, none of them cause any issues whatsoever in milling and baking. So it's really good news from that point of view. There's not going to be a kind of day zero when half of the varieties that bean growers were happily growing suddenly become delisted or unpopular or unsuitable for the new market.
So that's a good news story then. So we've got the varieties there to deliver what you're trying to achieve with this is sort of proof of concept. Presumably there are varieties that are better than others though, are you seeing a difference in what companies are breeding in terms of their suitability for what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, so I suppose the only thing that we think will make a difference in the short term is lysine content. So as you know, there are several spring low lysine varieties available already. The differential in yield between the highest yielding spring bean and the highest yielding low lysine spring bean has been closing. And that's kind of a reflection of the importance that breeders attach to bringing forward the low lysine trait. So we think that, by the time faba bean bread might be a commercial reality, I think there'll be a good choice of widely grown low lysine varieties. The other little curiosity is that a variety called LG Cartouche, which was commercialized briefly for a few years, it turns out to be super high in both protein, iron, and zinc. So it seems to be super dense in nutrients, which we thought was very interesting. And but sadly, that variety has fallen by the wayside. But the fact that it came forward at all means that those genes are out in the gene pool and may make a reappearance at some point.
And you talked about spoilers. Whereabouts are you in the process now of your findings? Have you published the sort of findings of your work now? Is it publicly available?
It's starting to come out of, as projects come to their end. Obviously, most of the data sets that were supposed to be there have appeared. We did our last trials in springtime last year and spent most of the winter doing post-harvest analysis on these. So we've got now a 4-year series of agronomy trials that will be hopefully very informative. Things like how to use judicious sulfur applications to push the protein content higher than it would be. There's a small yield benefit for that as well, which means that the sulfur treatment probably pays for itself, as well as making the protein higher quality and more abundant. That hasn't been written up yet because it's 4 years worth of data and we still have to pull it all together.
So yeah,
in the coming, the rest of 26.
More to come later this year. So the agronomists and growers that listen to this podcast are probably most interested in some of the agronomy and sort of practical growing aspects of the work that you've been doing. What sort of nuggets have you found along the way that you're able to share at this stage? I appreciate we don't want to put the cart in front of the horse, but have there been some interesting little findings along the way of the project?
So I alluded to the fact that there was this kind of super nutritionally dense variety that wasn't particularly appreciated before. I've mentioned the sulfur response. We then, from the harvest of these trials, we were able to take samples of each of these interesting varieties, which may have been managed with the correct sulfur application through the milling and processing pipeline. And, so there's some optimization that may be able to take place in the milling process, because there's different amounts of different balance between the seed coat and the cotyledon of the seed, the center of the seed, which is what we mill the flour from. You remove the coats. So that's a trait we'd like to look at in more detail in the future, is what's the optimum balance between the protective packaging of the seed and the content of the package. So let's say if you're ready to accept some variation in milling yield, then any variety is good to go. But let's say there are some subtleties, and it could be that if you're trying to get the last few percent of efficiency, you may be steered towards one variety over another based on the milling efficiency.
So let's move to the sort of other bit of the process in terms of, we know we can grow certain varieties with certain traits that will fill the end market if the market is there. How well joined up is that sort of the end of the market that perhaps is going to drive this demand? Like if we said tomorrow, we know what we need to do to be able to produce this 20% of a loaf of bread, how possible would it be, given the sort of supply chain we've got at the moment, to sort of turn that tap on if we wanted to?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's slightly outside of my purview as an academic, but I think you have models where grain handlers and exporters make contracts. I think you've talked about some of these contracts recently on a Inside the Pod podcast. There's plenty of precedents for saying, okay, we've got a certain specification we want to meet. Here's the seed and the agronomy package you need to meet that specification. And because there's some predictable market for it, we can put some boundaries on the price we can guarantee. So I would hope that there's prospects for this type of model to be used.
And in terms of the economics of what we're proposing here, is there anything different about the way that you would have to grow the faba beans in order to produce for this market that have increased costs, or any difference in production method that you'd need to consider that you've come across, which might make this sort of financially a challenge for growers, or not, as the case may be?
I don't think so. I think, once the variety choice has been made, definitely, almost definitely low Visine variety. But other than that, there's a good amount of leeway. And, given that the product is going to be baked after it's been dehulled and milled, we're not looking at for perfect seed coats, or, coloration of the seed coat is not, which can be off-putting to consumers looking for whole beans, is not going to be a critical parameter. So I actually think it might be quite easy to meet any future specification.
That's encouraging. That's often a challenge around beans for human consumption, like you say. Is the end product going to meet that specification? Doesn't sound like that's going to be a huge problem with this one. Have you come across anything in your work which has been a huge barrier, you perceive to be a huge barrier to actually achieving what you've set out?
So the technical problem solving turned out to be easy. Okay, the choice of variety, will be cut and dried in the end. The milling turns out to be more than technically feasible, even though it hadn't been done before we set about trying to do it. The baking turns out there's a limit to how much you can include before the properties of the bread start to get so fundamentally different that you wouldn't, it would create more problems than it would solve. But up to that limit, it's extremely feasible, and we think we should push all the way up to that limit. On the consumer side, consumers are kind of really ready for it. They may not wish to pay a premium for what they regard as a staple that they're used to getting as a loss leader, a kind of keenly priced loaf. So where it's going to be most challenging, and where we've put really a lot of effort into recent months, is to resolve the catch-22 of currently there are none of these loaves on the shelves. Therefore, there's no market. If there is to be a market, there needs to be a supply of faba bean flour, but the faba bean flour can't be made with no proven demand. So we're trying to resolve that Mexican standoff between, commissioners of own brand sliced bread. You can imagine who I'm referring to, who would be able to create that demand, and the people who, large-scale millers who could open up cheap source of bean flour. Okay, because if it's milled at the same scale as wheat is milled, it will be nearly as cheap, because farm gate price of beans is pegged to the price of wheat. So it might be 10% dearer, but it's only a fraction of the total ingredients list, and raw ingredients are only a fraction of the total cost of a loaf. So if we can get that last piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which is actually nothing to do with science and more to do with supply chain logistics, then I think it may get over the line.
This is a very similar sort of conversation as we have when we're discussing the NCS project, in that we have the agronomy, we have the growers, we've got the proof that we can do many of the things that we want to achieve with beans, but there's always going to be this push-pull, chicken and egg, call it what you like, situation where the market needs to be created and the demand, and there needs to be impetus throughout the supply chain to actually want to achieve this in order for it to work. So, I mean, it sounds, about putting words into your mouth, that sounds like we're in a similar sort of situation here, but maybe slightly different in that we're trying to market direct to the consumer for this one, and that's maybe slightly trickier than for animal, putting it into animal feed, for example.
Yeah, yeah, but the principle is the same.
So what's the sort of next stage of the project? You mentioned earlier we're at the stage now where you're trying to pull together the findings of all of the work that you've done, and is it now a case of bringing together all the final data before you presumably produce a final report at the end of the project, or is there more work to be done this season with beans in the ground at the moment?
No, the field work has kind of taken a back seat at the moment. There's a little bit of ongoing work with the industry baked prototype bread. The last kind of consumer acceptability studies, the initial ones were very, very promising. A bit of safety testing, shelf life testing, things that only really kind of come into play when you get, you've resolved everything else and you're really close to the point where to kind of a decision to go to market. Yeah, so that's probably, but we really want all of the wider studies that went on, things like, up to date assessment of where pulse consumption is at in the UK, the update of the evidence for health benefits, because those can kind of stimulate kind of and encourage other campaigns that are going on, public health, dietary advice campaigns. You may have heard of Beans is How and Bang in Some Beans. These are people doing very good work, trying to raise public awareness. Somebody like me, of course, will say that there needs to be the products in the marketplace that are cheap and convenient to enable you to meet you halfway if you've received that message and want to act upon it. So we'll get all our data out so that everybody who can make anything of any of the data, whether you're a grower looking at, sulfur application rates, timings, or somebody who's got a product with some beans in it and you want to know what the latest thoughts of consumers are on bean containing products. There'll be something for everybody.
This is a bit of a leading question, I guess, but I know the work that you're involved in, both with this project and some other areas of work you get involved in, they're really, they're sort of hooked around the unfulfilled potential of beans as a protein crop, I suppose. Is that something you really sort of believe quite strongly in? And how, I guess the reason I'm asking is that a lot of people who perhaps listen to this and hear about beans, there's lots of little projects going on to try and change things and sort of bring this potential to life. And it all comes from the right place in that we have to try and demonstrate that there is this potential there. How much potential is there for beans as a protein crop, do you think, from what we grow in the UK? Is it a really big market opportunity for UK growers and UK agriculture, do you think?
I think it is. I think the signs are there from other crops and other countries who have, they've taken in the same fundamental trends and facts as you and I are doing here now, but the conclusion they've come to is invest, 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 and kind of a strong government-wide strategy. Take Canada, for example, with their protein industries, or Australia, which has a state-backed breeding effort, and state support to create an export market, right? To serve export markets. So I think there's a huge amount of room to up our game in the UK, being more consistent and more generous, more farsighted in the kind of how research funding is allocated, but also to support the right types of innovation at the right time. Yeah. and maybe even to kind of step in and back a major bean processing plant. Why not? It's been done in other countries, and it's just been tried repeatedly in the UK, but it seems to keep on kind of 3 steps forward and 2 steps back.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a theme that comes up with a number of projects that we talk about on this podcast. Is that there is the potential, there is the will, particularly from the industry, to make this happen. You just need other players in the supply chain or government policy to change, or a fundamental value to improve the chances of these things coming to fruition as quickly as possible. It feels like we're talking in those sorts of areas again here. Yeah, so really interesting to hear about the project and what you found so far, Donal. If people would like to read more about this and keep tabs on it as the results from the project are released, where's the best place for them to go?
The university has a project website that contains all the latest updates and information about the project. So just Google Raising the Pulse, University of Reading, and it'll be your top result.
We'll add a link to that in the show notes as well. You can go straight to that page. Donal, it's been a pleasure talking to you this afternoon. Thank you very much for your time and for explaining the work of Raising the Pulse. And we look forward, hopefully, in the next couple of years to being able to buy a sliced loaf from the supermarket, which is made in part, at least, with some UK bean flour.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks, Ben.
That's it for today's episode of Inside the Pod. I hope you enjoyed what you've heard. And if you did, please leave us a 5-star review on your podcast provider of choice. If you're interested in learning more from the project, check out the show notes where we'll include a link to some of Donal's work that he's been involved in. And listen out for the next episode of Inside the Pod, which will be out very shortly as we count down to cereals. Thanks very much for listening. We hope you can join us again soon.